back to Efficio's Transforming Public Procurement Microcast series, where we're continuing to help break down key elements of the new regulations. We're just a few weeks away from go live of the new Act on 24th of February, and today I'm joined by Max Savidge, one of our public sector consultants at Efficio, to discuss assessment summaries under the new Procurement Act. Hi, Max. So, what are assessment summaries in the context of the new regulations?
Hey, Yehui, thanks for having me on. Right, so under the new Act, where a contracting authority has carried out a competitive tendering process, it must provide feedback to all suppliers who submitted an assessed tender through what the Act calls an assessment summary. So this essentially provides information to enable each supplier to understand why its tender was either successful or unsuccessful. And the assessment summary also allows unsuccessful suppliers to see how the authority has determined the most advantageous tender, or MAT, and how it has applied the tender assessment methodology and award criteria to come to the decision over the proposed award of the contract. And for those who are familiar with existing regs, assessment summaries will broadly fit the same function and replace what we currently refer to as standstill letters, although there are some important differences.
Yeah, Max, I was going to ask, what's changed from what we're doing today?
Yeah, so a few things. So, firstly, from a timing aspect, under the new Act, it's the publication of the contract award notice that initiates the new 8 working day standstill period. Whereas under current regs, it's the issuing of standstill letters, or as we're now calling them, assessment summaries, to participating suppliers, which triggers the standstill period. And also, and this is a major change for contracting authorities, they will no longer be required to provide a direct comparison between the successful supplier's assessed tender and an unsuccessful supplier's assessed tender.
Ooh, that's a really interesting change. So that brings me to my next question. What should we have in the assessment summary?
Yeah, of course. So for the successful supplier, the assessment summary will include the supplier name and their postal and email address. Also, their unique identifier, which is allocated by the central digital platform, and then all the award criteria. So that includes your assessment methodology or summary and relative importance or weighting of each criterion, and then how each criterion has been assessed by reference to scores and what scores were available. And then if the award criteria, including the assessment methodology, are not set out in full, an indication of where the full version can be found. And then finally, how the tender was assessed against the award criteria, including the score determined for each award criterion and the total score.
Right. And what about for those suppliers that were not so lucky? As we know, those letters can be a little bit more challenging to write.
Yeah, absolutely. So for the unsuccessful suppliers, first of all, the same as what we've just discussed about the successful supplier, obviously redacted to remove any commercially sensitive information about the successful supplier. We'll also have any further explanation of why the public contract is not being awarded to this unsuccessful supplier, so including whether the tender was disqualified under the assessment methodology and, if applicable, the reasons for that disqualification. And then finally, how the most advantageous tender was assessed against the award criteria by reference to scores. So an unsuccessful supplier reading the two sets of information alongside each other will be able to ascertain the relative advantages itself rather than the contracting authority having to effectively paint the picture by comparing the winning tenderer's bid with the unsuccessful tenderer's bid. And it's probably helpful to have a look at a template. And thankfully, the government commercial function has released some assessment summary templates last year. And they're really useful guidance and they're downloadable from the gov.uk website.
Thanks, Max. That is really comprehensive. And yes, we'll link the assessment summary template in the comments. Is there anything else worth covering before we close?
Yeah, so just one last thing to note is that assessment summaries are not always necessary in every circumstance. So first of all, when awarding a contract by reference to lots, the requirement to provide an assessment summary does apply to each contract awarded. Also, assessment summaries are not required when establishing a dynamic market. However, they are required when awarding a public contract under a dynamic market. Also, assessment summaries must be provided when awarding a framework that is a public contract, but not required when awarding a call-off contract, unless, of course, the framework terms set out a specific requirement to provide an equivalent. And then finally, assessment summaries are not required for any intermediate tender assessments or below threshold contracts.
Thanks, Max. That was a really great overview, sorry, of the assessment summaries and hopefully interesting for our viewers. I hope you enjoyed today's microcast. Please do post any thoughts or questions in the chat and get in touch with Max or myself for any future topics you might want to hear about. We'll see you next week.